Hello and welcome to Brick by Brick, where we bring together thought leaders from across the industry to discuss the key issues within the property sector. It's no secret that the housing sector is in a catastrophic state simply because we're not building enough houses. It's estimated that the housing shortage in the UK stands at a colossal 4.75 million homes. So what are the real barriers to house building, and how can the government and leaders from across the property sector work together to solve them? This is the subject of a new Brickflow white paper, Solving the UK's Housing Shortage. And today I welcome three of the report's contributors. From Knight Frank, we have Associate Anna Ward, Paul Davis, co-founder of Nimbus, and Steve Smith, Head of Sales for Mint Property Finance. Welcome, guys. So, on to our first question. With it taking an average of 5 years for a standard housing development to go through the planning system, it's clear that planning lies at the heart of the housing shortage. So why is our planning system such a mess, and what does the government need to do to fix it?
I think we've seen, a real sort of political stalemate in planning. So we've seen various U-turns. So all of that has created a lot of uncertainty. So if we go back to 2021, we obviously saw Boris Johnson try to push through zoning reform. So that could have fundamentally have overhauled the system, but he had to climb down on that following the by-election in Chesham and Amersham.
Was that his build, build, build mantra?
Yeah, exactly. So we've seen politicians come in with these big promises, and they have looked at overhauling the system, but there is a lot of opposition to do that. So from their own MPs, for example.
Yep.
More recently, we saw Rishi Sunak have to climb down on another policy. So he wanted to introduce or continue mandatory housing targets. And obviously that also faced quite a lot of opposition as well. Yeah. So his own MPs rebelled against that. So I think what we've seen recently is politicians have now got their hands tied. They can't necessarily bring in, the reforms that they might necessarily want. Obviously, we're currently in this position of major change. We're potentially going to see a new government come in. So that will be interesting to see sort of what they might be able to get through where the previous government has failed.
And is that in part down to constituents? Do you think, Paul, maybe?
Well, I suppose where my mind was going was that I think they've made a few steps in the right direction. I think some of the change they made in 2021, things like Class MA and these sorts of things, where you've got easier change of uses and things like that, I think it's been quite a big step forward. I think that does help give more clarity, more kind of confidence to the developer to get the consent that they're expecting, and then have confidence they can deliver it out at the right time. In terms of how that kind of plays out, I think that's a good step forward, but whether they can still maintain traction with that sort of stuff is be an interesting question to sort of see.
But the Conservatives are sort of naturally known for perhaps having constituents that are more classed as a NIMBY. So do you think that plays into how much can actually be truly done by a government?
Well, good question. I don't know the answer to that, if I'm perfectly honest. I think the changes to the legislation will be very helpful, and I think that does give developers what they need to deliver housing out that we need. And I think that also plays, because the legislation has changed, it plays into the NIMBYism being more challenging. So a lot of our experience has been that NIMBYism around the actual consent itself, and should we get consent, and sort of having conversations with the councils and this sort of stuff. And so I think that clarity around legislation will be very helpful.
Yeah. And Steve, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. It's always, politicians do always say, we're going to change things, we're going to do this, we're going to make things easier, we're going to make planning easier, we're going to make building houses easier, which sounds great. It's a great soundbite, but nothing's massively changed. And we're looking at these planning conditions in councils that are archaic, really, how they perform and how they act. And I was at a venue last night with a load of developers in Cardiff, and a guy had to do one planning selection in Wales. He used the same architect to do one in Bristol, which is just literally across, the water.
Yeah.
And he had to change it completely because they wouldn't accept it. And so again, just delays, money, just even to get the planning in place to try and get planning is now delayed. So it just needs a bit of an overhaul, really, to be honest.
And I mean, 5 years seems an incredible amount of time for a standard housing development.
It's huge, but even on a small scale, we do some of the smaller stuff ourselves, and you look at sort of 3-4 houses, it can take 6 months. It's crazy timings.
No, it seems to be something that we hear all the time as well. I was speaking to a developer recently. He's based in Somerset, and his planning officer is based in Birmingham.
Yeah,
and has never been Somerset.
Makes no sense at all.
Yeah, it's a bit strange. Okay, Right, well, thanks for that, guys. Now sort of moving on to our second question, which is around land supply. So another key barrier to building houses is, of course, land supply. With only 0.2% of land in England available for development. That's not much to go around. So what can be done to give developers better access to more land on more affordable land? Who wants to kick us off? Paul?
Well, as I say, I'm a big believer of brownfield land. I'm a big believer of of repositioning existing buildings into residential ultimately. And I think with the impact of COVID and the way that's changed the high street, the way it's changed the demand for industrial buildings and this kind of stuff, the introduction of Class E as the kind of new commercial use space, kind of being able to change some of that stuff that we no longer need into residential, I think is a really big opportunity for us at the moment. So I think some of that is where we can really make a difference. That repurposing, that kind of the brownfield land, the locations that are naturally sustainable because that's where the jobs are and where the kind of the employment space is. I think that becomes very interesting.
And recent government announcements, Michael Gove made a big play on the fact that brownfield is where we really need to concentrate.
Absolutely. And airspace, of course.
Yeah. And are you seeing that come through yet? Is there early indications that this is going to be a successful policy? Well,
so we do an awful lot of this sort of stuff and supporting our customers to do this, and we've seen a lot of excitement around that. The kind of the ability to change the use of certain buildings that naturally would change use and would work very well and would provide an awful lot of housing.
Yeah.
Kind of typically flats rather than housing actually, but that we've found has been very, very interesting and a lot of interest in that.
Yeah, great. Anna, do you want to come in on this one?
I mean, I totally agree. A brownfield first policy is important, but I would add that inevitably we are going to have to start building on some greenbelt land. I think that is important, and I think that is now, at the forefront of the political debates that we're seeing. You've had Labour come forward with, the grey belt we need to build on, low grade quality green belt to start with. I think the other thing that's very important as well is to reduce the planning risk that we currently see at the moment in the market. So, you've got developers that want to bring land forward for development, but the issue is the planning risk that they face. So, even just to, for example, even just an environmental impact assessment that could run up into the millions. There's huge amounts of cost in this. And then at the end of the day, they don't know, what's going to happen at the end of the sort of planning tunnel. Like, are they going to get planning permission? Will they have to go back? So I think we need to focus, or the new government needs to focus on reducing that planning risk. I think that the idea originally around the zoning system, where you could automatically designate some land for development so that it would get automatic planning permission, I think that is a good idea. It would, of course, involve a fundamental overhaul of the system, but I think it could be relooked at. One thing I thought was interesting that Labour has put forward is the brownfield passports that's been mooted. So I think that would at least sort of touch on one aspect of the zoning plans, but it is, of course, just tinkering. It's not sort of an overhaul. So it would be interesting to see, to what extent they sort of bring that forward and whether they also look at the zoning system as well.
Yeah, I think the uncertainty it can kill a business. You can have multiple schemes in play, but they can all be delayed, and it can be a bit of a bottomless pit when it comes to the capex to get the scheme off the ground. So I think as an SME, that could kill your business, right, overnight.
Yeah.
Steve?
Absolutely. And I think we're all in the same opinion with brownfields. It's the way to go, absolutely. But some developers struggle there because it costs a lot more money sometimes to actually make something of another use because it may have been something else. We've seen a lot of commercial to residential. We've seen a lot of commercial to semi-commercial, but that's mainly for the income streams of rent, which is perfectly normal. But I think it is interesting. We could learn probably something from some of our European neighbours about building on, green belt, but actually making sort of fewer houses with parkland, with sort of the eco message going through. And I think that's what's happening more and more sort of in a Germany, in a Denmark, for example. And I think we could learn that and maybe not just build a brand new estate, but it can be sort of, fewer houses, but with a more eco sort of structure base to them. And I think that could help with the green belt.
I think when the phrase green belt gets mentioned, everyone thinks of like quintessentially English meadows, countryside, whereas actually a lot of it is, as you were saying, Anna, is grey belt.
And that's the new word, isn't it? Grey belt, which I actually quite like, because it's actually, because a lot of people will hear grey belt and go, no, you can build on that. Whereas
Yeah.
green belt is that tugs at your heartstrings.
Yeah.
And there's quite a lot of the country where it doesn't really stack up to build new housing. So we have to be very, very mindful of the fact that the places that we can build housing is where it's financially viable to do so. And there are vast swathes of the country that are just washed over by greenbelt where that financial viability works. And so trying to unlock that in some way that still works, where that greenbelt isn't necessarily quite as valuable as other parts of it, and maintain the feel of the UK and what is quintessentially British is absolutely right.
Yeah.
But sort of flexing that slightly where things are well connected, where it is that grey belt, I think is a really important thing to be looking at.
That uniform approach to greenbelt is everything is greenbelt.
Absolutely,
You
complete
can't
washover
touch
and-
it.
Yeah,
and
even if it's a car park.
and
it's
it's too polar. It needs
Yeah,
some shades
yeah,
of grey in the middle.
On that point, actually, on connection, I think that is important. The infrastructure needs to be there. And I think at the moment you do get housing schemes that, people still need to basically get in a car and to access any kind of, shops or whatever they need. Whereas
Yeah.
I think it is important that, these sites are well conceived from the outset. So you don't get this sort of NIMBYism kicking in. So people see the value, see what it will add to the community right from the start, so that you avoid having these sort of soulless sort of communities. These developments need to have resources alongside them. So that's really important, I think, from the beginning.
Which is that additional infrastructure cost
Yeah.
at the outset, right? If it's not connected,
Yeah.
it just makes it so much harder
Yeah.
to take on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, guys. Funding, question 3. So 41% of SME house builders claim sites have stalled due to issues with funding. Rocketing interest rates are, of course, a huge challenge. But what does the government need to do to make funding schemes more accessible to SMEs? And what role does the commercial sector have to play? Steve, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, by all means. I think when you look at it, you go, okay, the government does have a part to play, and there could be some incentives there to actually get sort of land available to us. But what we're seeing really in the market is you're looking at, it's a bit of a perfect storm. You've had sort of GDVs have lessened because obviously the interest rates came, houses are going to be less, land's going to be less in sort of 12 months' time. So GDVs from valuers have been sort of like shortened and curtailed compared to where they thought they were. Building costs have gone up to sort of impact that, and then finance costs have gone up. So when developers have been doing this for the last 10 years, have sort of had very cheap finance, and sort of, the GDVs have worked in their favor because, prices are going up, lovely. They're suddenly now looking and going, actually, that doesn't work. That sort of, my last 5 developments that I've done worked perfectly, but if I do the same, it's not going to work.
Sure.
So there is sort of a point that there is money, where, there is money out there, but it's at a different price now. And I think people have to work around that. You have to be a little bit cleverer with how you maybe source it. You want to use Brickflow, for example, go and have a look at sort of sources and find out where it is. Talk to a broker, talk to whoever you need to actually get that finance cost at the cheapest you can.
Yeah.
But also check out sort of the other costs involved, do you have to build on that land right there? Or can you build in a brownfield site over there? Is that going to be cheaper for you? So I think there's a lot to do. I think there's a lot more sort of prep work now. You can just go in and make money. You have to be a little bit more cautious and a little bit more careful. You can still do very, very well, don't get me wrong. But I think people just need to be, the finance costs have gone up. The government could do more. But at this moment in time, it's sort of a developer will go, well, nothing's happening for me right now, so I've got to do it myself. But there are certain things they can still do to make it sort of more cost effective.
I think the big thing that we're hearing and seeing is the equity gap. Obviously, with development finance, bridging finance, it's forward funded.
Yeah.
So if interest costs go up, then the loan actually available to the developer gets smaller.
Absolutely.
So actually, if you look at the last 2 years, where the way interest rates have gone, per million of borrowing, your amount of equity you'd need to put in is an extra 50,000.
Yeah.
So if the average development loan is £5 million, then that's actually an extra £250,000 the developer's got to find. And if you put that across multiple sites for like more of a regional house builder, and perhaps people doing bigger sites, that's a big
huge
crunch.
And they don't have that cash liquidity. They don't,
especially with sales slowing.
Yeah, exactly. And also prices maybe actually dropping off what they thought they were going to have in the first place. Now they've built these houses. So it is, I think there's a lot more sort of scratching of head at the start. I think that's necessary. I think people need to talk more. They need to talk to other people more about sort of not just people in architects, but sort of, developers themselves, other developers in the area, getting the developer group even, and start finding out how you can actually cut costs in the right way, rather than just go the same way that you've always done for the last 5-10 years, because it won't work as well.
Yeah. But do you think there's a responsibility with the government? Because ultimately they want people to build housing. Eventually the market will come good, as in we always have these peaks and troughs.
Yeah.
Is there a responsibility perhaps for government now to come in and help some of these SME developers or even bigger house builders just to supplement through this adjustment, really, which is being caused by the government as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is, because they're not really building the houses either. So,
Right.
It's probably easy for them in some ways to actually incentivize some SMEs to go out and build rather than actually do it themselves.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
but we're not seeing a lot of that at the moment, are we?
And is that something through Homes England? Perhaps they could do an initiative?
Perhaps they could do initiative. And I think there is something to be said for either, sort of loans or cheaper land in certain areas where it is a grey belt or a brown, field site. I think there's things that they could do, but we're just not seeing a lot of that happening at this moment.
I mean, the double-edged sword with costs increasing, obviously, is that land prices go down, which, I mean, speaking to some developers, this is the market they've been waiting for 10 years. So how are you seeing that on the platform?
What we're seeing is that I suppose traditionally you think about buying a piece of land and you pay X for that land. What we're finding is that developers are now sort of searching further and wider for opportunities and then being more selective around the opportunities they move forward with. And for those opportunities, typically sharing some of the risk with the landowner, so that in effect you're structuring a deal whereby you're paying overages or you're sort of paying a percentage of open market value of the land at certain points and this sort of stuff. And so rather than necessarily sort of the funding issue being kind of around the finance, around the build costs, around the GDVs and this sort of stuff, is actually structuring the land value in a way that kind of works, and whether the land is sort of the uplift and the planning gain that's being achieved through that change of use is then being shared a little bit with the landowner and a little bit with the developer, so that things naturally kind of work as a result of that. And I think that's really, it's taken time, I think, for that to be sort of baked into things. But I think with the clear higher risk in the marketplace at the moment, with kind of less certainty around exit values and this sort of stuff, I think landowners are starting to become much more sort of accepting of this sort of thing. And that then means the whole thing can start to fund itself again. So where you're in this rising market, there's a real temptation just to have to pay a price for a piece of land.
Yeah.
Whereas now we find that's much more structured and sort of a different approach to the way it's bought.
That transition, I mean, I guess we've still probably got a way to go, right?
Yeah, it's not fixed yet, but it's certainly moving that way.
Still to come. And how are you seeing it, Anna, on your side?
Yes, so to add to that, actually, we're certainly hearing of the house builder market. They're looking to conserve cash, so land deals are being structured in different ways. Potentially, they're looking to sort of pay further down the line. So there are all sorts of different sort of structures around purchases going on at the moment. On the SME side of things, we actually survey around sort of a mix of 50 volume and SME house builders every quarter. And one thing that has come to the fore recently is just this issue of sort of accessing development finance. So when we started the survey in sort of 2021, this wasn't an issue. None of them are reporting it. So we've gone from sort of 0 to 15% of our respondents actually saying this is a problem. So I think that on top of Steve's point on material costs, which I think people forget, they are still going up, and materials have gone up like 43% over the past 2 years. So we're talking about a really elevated level still. Costs are more manageable now, but it is, it's still difficult on margins. So I think, for the immediate future, it is going to still be quite tough out there on development.
I was reading the annual report of a national house builder, and they were saying now that they've changed entirely to a return on capital employed model. So they're now looking for 40% ROCE on every deal. So that's leading them to go a lot more towards JVs with landowners. So it's really interesting that a national house builder's gone from that profit on cost or profit on GDV model to
that is another big change. So we're also seeing, for example, house builders look to sell off sort of chunks of their schemes to, say, single family housing rental investors. So sort of that increase in sort of alternative living investors there. That's sort of a win-win for both at the moment, because obviously these single family housing rental guys, they can then sort of expand their reach in the regions. obviously for house builders, they don't want to necessarily sell all their stock build to sell at the moment. So it gives them income at a difficult time in the market. So I think we will see an increase in that. There's obviously more demand as well for families to rent instead of buy at the moment as well, given mortgage costs.
I guess the big winners with this is probably the BTR funds, right? Which is something the government earmarked many years ago, that they wanted the sector to become more professional and BTR to be a bigger part. So have the government been playing some 3D type of chess that none of us got, and this is the plan all the way along?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, obviously Labour's very pro sort of home ownership. That's a big kind of key part of their policy. But ultimately, with mortgage costs remaining so elevated, we are going to see an increase in rental demand, and that, and making that sector more professionalised can only be a good thing, really. So increasing, I don't think it's just about increasing housing supply. We need to think about types of housing, and think about what the demand is as well. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys. So our fourth question is about technology. So the housing sector has traditionally been resistant to technology and innovation, yet in reality, it should be an enabler for our industry. Where should the government be investing in technology, and thinking about your own role in the sector? How can technology positively improve processes to ultimately increase house building? Paul, this is a topic close to your heart. Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, totally. I mean, where we're particularly interested is around the acquisition piece. So it's understanding if you can go off market, then the way in which you acquire sites can be very different from if you're on market. If you're on market, you're bidding the best price you can based on your residual value calculation, and that's GDV minus build costs and minus profit. So everything's kind of as thin as possible to win that competitive bid on market. What we're finding is that if you go off market, then of course you're direct to the owner. You can share some of the planning game and typically pay them a bit more than they might get on an open market bid. But of course, that shares the risk with the developer. So the developer then can always buy land at a price they know can make stack. They're typically in a much better place as a result of that. So we focus an awful lot on that, based on what we do. But I think one of the things that we find is interesting is that the data that we ingest from the government can be a right mess. And we spend a lot of time cleaning it and linking it and trying to make it the best it possibly can be for the end customer, the developer trying to acquire the sites ultimately. And so I think there could be quite a lot of investment from the government around making sure the data sets they've got are clean and tidy and the best they can make them ultimately. And that investment, I think, then would flow into a lot of parts of the economy that would then really help move the needle on this. So for me, that's where I'd want the government to invest more is around make sure they're capturing the right information, making sure that is neat and tidy and as clean as possible, so that then it can be used as best as possible by the property industry.
Yeah. And for you, Emma?
Well, one thing I think is really interesting at the moment is just innovation around net zero. So for the new build sector, sort of what's coming down the tracks. Obviously, the government has kicked the can down the road. So, for example, gas boilers are not going to be phased out now until 2035. Previously, it was 2025. So, I guess the urgency of that has slightly cooled down a bit. But I think companies know that they need to increase their sustainability, so it is still going to be important.
It's on the roadmap.
Yeah, exactly. So, and there are some interesting things happening. So there's the Energy 2.0 house that's in partnership with the University of Salford. So the house builder Barratt's involved in that. And what they're essentially doing is testing new builds under sort of various kind of global warming constraints. So they're literally kind of fabricating the weather. They're throwing sort of snow, solar radiation at these buildings and just seeing how they perform. So they're sort of switching up from freezing to really hot temperatures in sort of a 24-hour period, and then innovating to see sort of what materials they need to use. And obviously this is really relevant given all these heat waves that we've been experiencing. So I think that kind of innovation around that will be interesting. The problem at the moment, of course, as you're probably aware, is that all of these things are still really expensive for consumers. So I think the government does need to continue to invest in this kind of research, because until it's relatively affordable, they just can't sell it politically. It's just too expensive to sort of retrofit all of these homes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, subsidies have a big part to play.
Yeah.
How about yourself, Steve?
I think innovation's just sort of passed us by a lot of the points in home builders full stop. It's like desktop valuations were suddenly the big thing sort of a few years ago, and it's like, how's that just happened a few years ago? Why was that not happening 20 years ago?
Sure.
And so and going back to the first question on planning, I mean, why is it not standardised across the country? How hard can that be to get some automation in there and actually standardise whether I want to live in Somerset or build a house in Wales or build a house in Cheltenham? It doesn't matter, does it? It shouldn't matter, but it does. So I think there's a lot of things we can do that are quite simple, but all these things cost money. And I think at the moment, that's probably the big kicker for everything that we talk about is, do we want the government, for example, we want to spend a huge amount of money on something else that's innovation? They should, that's what we want them to do, but they've got to balance the books as well, haven't they?
Divert some HS2 money.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah.
But as a business, are you investing in your technology?
Yeah, you have
your
to.
Processes?
You really do have to, and I think it's really important to get the right processes and to be ahead of the game and to see what's coming and see what you can use. So yeah, we use a lot. Silly little things like apps to, instead of sending your passport and sort of ID, you can just do it on an app now, and all those kind of things. Simple, efficient. Yeah. I mean, again, easier for the customer as well and the borrower. It's what we're all about now. With if you can do it on an app, do it on an app. It saves all of that hassle and time. And all we want to do is save people hassle and time and money.
Yeah.
So it's sort of, there's a lot of innovation out there that we can sort of use, but I think there's an awful long way to go to match sort of where we should be.
Well, I think we've always talked about I think it's the last sector anywhere in the world to embrace technology.
Sadly, yeah.
It's really, really still got a long way to go.
Yeah.
So to sum up from each of you, what 3 recommendations would you make to government if you were sitting in front of Michael Gove or Rishi Sunak? What would you say to them? What do you believe is instrumental to solving the UK's housing shortage? Steve, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, by all means. I think we need to get this green, brown, grey belt sorted. I think we need to sort of tackle that, probably as a society as well, because as we said earlier, green belt, everybody just goes, oh my God, no, you can't possibly touch it. And I think the grey belt idea is actually quite a good one. I think that could have some legs, and I think we need to run with that a little bit.
It's quite a nice soundbite, isn't it? You can see like people getting behind that. Oh, it's great. It's okay.
It's okay. Yeah, nobody likes
grey.
And for you, Anna?
How many have I got? 1, 3, 6?
Should we go one each?
One each. Okay. I think it would be really a positive step to relook at the zoning system. I mean, this is used in other parts of the world, in Europe, and I think it does. I mean, currently the UK planning system, there is that sort of core discretionary element, which in some cases is really valuable. But I think it would help to have some sort of a sort of automatic permissions element in part of the system. So whether the brownfield passports addresses that under Labour, who knows? But I think fundamentally we need to relook at the whole system and take something new moving forward. Otherwise, the uncertainty and all that risk in planning is just going to deter developers.
Yeah, agreed. How about you, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I echo what the others have said. I think the grey land bit is super interesting. I think the zoning's super interesting. I think the steps that the government have made around PD, community development, has been very helpful. But I still think there's sort of question marks about airspace. How many stories can I get on this site is a complete black art as far as I'm concerned at the moment.
Right.
Is it 5 stories? Is it 8 stories? Is it 12? It's down to
the
women.
And I'd consider you to know more than most. So
yes,
if you don't know, then
sometimes you can get 2 stories on top with a Class ZA or whatever. But like it's not clear what you can actually get, and if you went in for a full application, will you get 5, 8, 12, or and I think that opens a huge opportunity for us to reposition some of this brownfield land into some much higher density stuff in the right locations, obviously for the right scheme. But I think that would be very helpful as well.
So I'd like to say a big thank you to Anna Ward from Knight Frank, Paul Davis from Nimbus, and Steve Smith from Mint Property Finance for joining us. If you'd like to know more, download the Brickflow white paper, Solving the UK's Housing Shortage at brickflow.com. Thank you and thanks for watching.